Of the lack of Halloween videos for this month compared to the previous years, it's not going to stop me on reviewing this Halloween episode that has been premiered recently from the Loud House, Great Lakes Freakout. This is the first episode after the Cross-Dragon days came to an end, centering around the Cross-Dragon days, and for me personally, after watching this episode, I would say that it did deliver, considering that it's been 5 years since the last time we had a Halloween episode involving the Loud House. But at the same time, there were a few problems that overweigh the positives sometimes. I'm just saying, when I had mixed opinions on whether or not I'm going to review this episode when it aired, it's most likely the fact that I don't usually see this episode as special, regardless if it's a crossover between the Loud House and the Cross-Dragon days. The plot to this episode centers around the Cross-Dragon days decorating the store for the Halloween contest, while Ernesto, which is Rosa's idol, is going to be the judge, and with the help of the other characters trying to make the store itself spooky as heck, they're definitely going to win the contest. To be honest with you, when I first saw the synopsis of this episode, I wasn't really expecting much. Like I said, it's been 5 years since the Loud House has a Halloween episode, and having a Halloween episode taking place in Great Lake City isn't a problem whatsoever. And for me personally, this was a lot more watchable compared to Curse of the Candy Goblin episode from the Cross-Dragon days. But at the same time, with the lack of characters like Luna, Luann, Lola, and Frida, despite the fact that she makes a slight cameo by speaking in this episode, I really wasn't expecting much from this episode exactly. Like, if I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you, one of the reasons why I actually enjoyed this episode a lot more compared to Curse of the Candy Goblin is that it actually makes the characters likable compared to how they were portrayed in Curse of the Candy Goblin. It may be towards the Cross-Dragon days characters, but for me personally, the fact that we have an episode involving a store being decorated in Halloween or spooky material, then it's honestly a new for me. Like, for the amount of times that I've seen Tricked involving the characters just trying to save Halloween, all the while in Curse of the Candy Goblin it's just all about not being selfish while also having a baby tag along on your Halloween journey. I can say for a fact that there was actual care into this. Granted, Tricked is still the better Halloween episode, but the way that this episode is executed involving these characters, and the fact that this is another crossover between the Loud House and the Cross-Dragon days, I felt like it really did a better job. And even if the Thanksgiving episode is better compared to this, regardless of my opinions of the episode has changed over time, it's not like that this Halloween episode was a bad idea, because for me personally, having the other characters from the Loud House appear in this in order to help out the Cross-Dragon days with the store to be as spooky as possible, which led to Lucy bringing along her spell book, which also led to Carl using the spell book to his advantage in order to make the store itself more spooky. It's honestly a lose-lose situation for everyone, because anything can happen, and for me personally, when it centers around a zombie apocalypse at one point, you pretty much knew that something is going to happen towards the end. I'm just saying, I know I've been way too critical involving the ghosts and fantasy elements into this, but when I saw reviews involving that there are truly ghosts that are somewhat acceptable in the Loud House world because of the Season 2 episode that, let's just say that due to my lack of Ghostbusters knowledge, it's mostly on me for not remembering that episode completely because I only watched it once. It somewhat made my critiques towards Ghost and maybe the Operation Freakout episode, the Ghost episode from the Cross-Dragon days from Season 3, somewhat outdated. But for me personally, my opinions towards those episodes didn't improve completely. As in that I don't like them completely more due to the fact that they dropped the down-to-earth elements. Like, in this episode where it has zombies and ghosts into it, it works because if they did a different ideal involving a typical Halloween episode where the characters just go trick-or-treating, it would be similar to Curse of the Candy Goblin, but slightly better. And at the same time, I think that if it wasn't for Lucy's spellbook or the fact that Carl just caused most of these events to happen, I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't be able to have this episode entirely and would have had a different episode completely. Let me tell you that this episode alone is mostly in the middle between Tricked and Curse of the Candy Goblin. I mean, the effort that was put into this episode isn't as high compared to Tricked, but it was much more better than Curse of the Candy Goblin. Like, the thing is, regardless if you didn't like my opinions towards Curse of the Candy Goblin, that doesn't automatically mean that I judge you for liking that episode completely, regardless if you have different opinions than I do. Because when I look at this episode in particular, it really feels like that two shows after one show came to an end, they're just trying everything in order to make us enjoy the Cross of God days as the show lasted for about a couple of years until it ends. Like I said, there's a chance that there's going to be a season 8 being renewed, but when it comes to the Cross of God days, it's probably going to come to a point where there's going to be at least 5 or more episodes involving the Cross of God days appearing in the Loud House in the future, mainly from each season. And considering that we're getting a Lenny and Carlotta episode in season 6 soon, I'm starting to convince that in season 7, there's probably going to be a lot of ideals involving the Loud House and the Cross of God days. Like, if some people are going to say that the really loud house is the reason why the Cross of God days came to an end, then keep in mind, you can also make the argument that the Patrick Star Show is the reason why the Cross of God days came to an end. And for me personally, I was one of those people, and after thinking about it, and the fact that the final episodes of the Cross of God days were somewhat mixed, especially the final episode, then you're really not missing anything completely if you skip out the Cross of God days. Because, if I'm gonna be honest, the final episode is way more similar to how Lori moved out of the house in season 2, and it's no surprise that the Lori episode is better than the Bobby episode, because in this episode, there was no mentioning that Bobby moved out of the Cross of God days apartments, to the point that it just makes the ending of that episode really weak. And I was one of those people who thought that Ryan, Bobby, and their mother are gonna go back to where it was. And for me personally, it's been 5 years. I mean, it may be a long time, but considering that they kept the changes Parliament back in 2017, I'm going to assume that the only reason why we end up getting a lackluster finale of the Cross of God days is because they just can't be able to make new ideas to make a proper finale if they did a season 4. And judging for how Carl just kept Lucy's spellbook after the Loud family left, I was honestly expecting another episode involving the Cross of God days if it was renewed, to the point that instead of just getting this crossover episode, we end up getting a different episode involving Carl stealing the Lucy spellbook. Granted, I could be wrong because we still end up getting this at the end of the day, but still. When it comes to this episode for the trick-or-treating along with ghosts and zombies, I honestly thought that this was going to be a zombie apocalypse story at some point, knowing of how that they advertised this episode involving zombies. But considering it only happens in the second half of the episode, where Carl, Bobby, and Victor were trying to stop the zombies by capturing them, I honestly thought that we end up getting a zombie apocalypse story at the end of the day. But considering that this is a Halloween episode, I really felt like that what we ended up getting involving the ending was just mostly involving the Mikado being decorated in Halloween material. For me personally, For what Carl, Bobby, and Victor did in this episode wasn't in selfishness completely. And to be honest with you, for what they did involving it's all their fault cliche that they've done so many times isn't as bad compared to the past episodes. Because at the same time, I would probably be on board in order to make their store as much spooky in order to win the contest. And considering that decorating the indoor of the house is still similar to decorating the outside of the building, still centers around a contest involving decorations, is honestly accurate to what they're trying to accomplish. And the only reason why the Casagrande won the decorated contest was because of the appearance of Boris. You know, as much as I do not like the lack of intelligence from the adults from this show, I can't say that this is a terrible move because it's during the Halloween season, and if you do something like this, regardless if it's mostly unintentional, you would probably get something at the end. But like I said earlier, there are problems in this episode, and I've already addressed the whole Bobby thing to the point that it just makes the finale of the Casagrandes lackluster. I'm talking about Ryan. One of the issues that I have is that she doesn't do much in this episode other than decorating the Mikado and tag along on the Halloween situation. Because let me tell you, the fact that Ryan is being portrayed as a character who is acting like a female version of Lincoln rather than just being her own character as they establish in the earlier seasons despite the poor development, I really felt like that she could have done a lot more other than just having the other characters take the spotlight, because the fact that the other characters have more screen time than her is really saying something, knowing full well that once we got to a point that the Casagrande came to an end, I was really expecting that this episode was centered around her development with Lincoln, and for anyone who mentions this, no, I doubt that Lincoln and Ryan are going to be together, because in one of the episodes from season 1 of the Casagrandes, it's revealed that Ryan doesn't want to be in a romantic relationship with Lincoln, not the other way around. And considering that no one in production have the idea of Lincoln being paired with a girl, it's honestly difficult to see Ryan in this position. Not because of the fact that Lincoln is going to be into another girl in the live action version, but the fact that Ryan is just being a tool for diehard shippers at this point. And that's not really a good thing, knowing full well of how other shows have this trope that really damages those shows completely. I mean, the only thing that is good about this is that since that Ryan is still staying at Great Lake City, they're not going to hammer it in completely, and if there was ever a chance where we actually have an episode with Lincoln and Ryan together, it would definitely have nothing to do with romance and actually try to develop the relationship a lot better. I mean, granted, you could say that it did happen in the past, but something completely different if you're going to have a crossover between the Loud House and the Casagrandes. I mean, the Thanksgiving episode was acceptable because it centers around Loie and Bobby, but even for a Halloween episode, there should have been a lot more, especially since that this is the first time the Casagrandes are going to be appearing in the Loud House show after the show came to an end. And trust me when I say this, in the cooking episode, the Forks Out episode, there were people on DeviantArt that were really bashing on this episode because of the Lincoln and Ryan shipping fuel. And guess what? The same thing happened to this, except that Ryan isn't really much of a main character in this, since that she doesn't do much in this episode other than just going trick-or-treating. That's how much that this episode, that's just how much that people just really hate this shipping, and yet at the same time, this episode really feels like a Lucy/Carla episode than anything, and even if that was supposed to be the case all along, it didn't change the fact that haters would just instantly bash on the shipping of Ryan and Lincoln no matter what. At this point, my shippings towards the shows are completely different, but considering that I never had an actual hate involving any shipping in the show, then the hate stum is just getting really, really old. At this point, we should all know that this episode has nothing to do with Lincoln and Ryan being in a romantic relationship, and the fact that it has so much shipping fuel between Bobby and Lori to the point that it's surprising that they didn't get married yet. I just want that wedding episode so that the haters will finally shut up, so that the family-in-law gimmick is put into play to the point that Ryan and Lincoln are officially siblings-in-law. Seriously, this is literally the only way for all this to be gone completely and be dropped forever. But if haters are gonna find a way to come around it, then it goes to show that the fandom is going to remain even more toxic no matter what the show does. With that being said, I found this episode enjoyable, better than Curse of the Candy Goblin, but nowhere near as better as Tricked. And at the same time, I really felt like that with this being another era of the Loud House where the live action show is going to be coming out, which people will instantly bash on it regardless if it's going to have a fan base of its own. All the while the Cross-Agantes are going to appeal, I'm still going to make Loud House vs. Cross-Agantes episodes in the future. Especially the Christmas one that I'm going to be uploading in December. And since that the people who have been working on the Cross-Agantes were originally part of seasons 1 through 2 of the Loud House, then there's a chance that the Loud House might regain its popularity in some other way in the future, knowing forward that they're coming back for seasons 6, 7, and possibly 8. I'm giving this episode a 6.5 out of 10.